There are years that test a couple quietly behind closed doors, and there are years that test them in full public view, one headline at a time. For Chip and Joanna Gaines, the stretch from mid-2025 into the summer of 2026 has been the second kind. No single crisis defines it. Instead, it's been a steady accumulation of moments, a health scare that never fully went away, a show that split their audience right down the middle, and a family that, through all of it, kept showing up for each other in ways the cameras only partly capture. This is the real story, built from what Chip and Joanna have actually said, what their network has actually aired, and what their fans have actually seen play out in real time. It's easy to forget, more than a decade after Fixer Upper first premiered on HGTV in 2013, just how ordinary Chip and Joanna Gaines' beginnings were. They met in the waiting room of Joanna's father's auto shop in Waco, Texas. Back in 2001, they dated for about a year before Chip proposed, and in 2003, they married at the historic Earl Harrison house in their hometown. There was no production crew, no network deal, no Magnolia empire waiting for them. Just two people building a life in Central Texas, one flip house at a time. What followed is, by now, a familiar American success story. Fixer Upper turned a modest renovation business into a media brand. Magnolia Market, the silos, a bakery, a restaurant, a real estate company, a best-selling cookbook, a quarterly journal, and eventually an entire cable network bearing their name. All of it grew out of two people who, by their own account, spent years before their big break, simply trying to make it to the next Friday. Joanna has spoken about those lean years candidly, describing a stretch during the housing crisis when the question every week wasn't about growth. It was about survival. That history matters, because it's a foundation everything since has been built on top of, including the two storylines that have defined their year. Long before any of Joanna Gaines' recent headlines, there was a basket toss. Joanna has said publicly more than once that her back problems trace back to a cheerleading stunt in high school, a routine that went wrong and left her with a herniated disc she would carry, in one form or another, for the next 2 decades. She had her first microdiscectomy, a minimally invasive procedure to relieve pressure on the affected nerve, back in 2001. It was serious enough, she said, that it forced her to cancel an early date with a man who would become her husband. The injury resurfaced in a bigger way at the end of 2022. Joanna underwent a second microdiscectomy just before the holidays that year, sharing a hospital bed photo with fans and describing the forced rest as an unexpected gift during the busiest season of the year. She leaned into the downtime rather than fighting it, using the recovery period to slow down with her kids around the fireplace, instead of running at the pace the Gaines schedule usually demands. By January 2025, Joanna was giving fans an update that sounded like real progress. She and Chip had started training with a personal trainer months earlier, and she admitted that on day one, she couldn't even manage a push-up because of her back. A few months later, she said she'd never felt stronger. It was framed as a comeback story, proof that consistent, unglamorous work had paid off. Then, in the middle of 2025, the injury pulled her back into recovery mode again. Joanna underwent another procedure connected to the same old high school injury, describing herself as grateful for the forced rest even as it landed during one of the busiest working stretches of a year. It's the kind of detail that's easy to skim past in a headline, but it says something real about what Joanna has been managing quietly for more than 20 years. A body that keeps needing attention, even while the business around her keeps expanding. There's no indication in anything she or Chip has said publicly that this is anything beyond the ongoing management of a decades-old spinal injury, but it's also clearly not a one-and-done story. It's a recurring part of her life, one she's chosen to be transparent about rather than hide. If Joanna's health has been the quieter storyline of the past year, the loudest one by far has been Back to the Frontier, the Magnolia Network series, which premiered on HBO Max and Magnolia Network on July 10th, 2025, follows 3 modern American families as they give up their phones, their cars, and their comforts to live for 8 weeks the way homesteaders did in the 1880s. On paper, it's a fish-out-of-water format Chip and Joanna's audience already knew how to love. Hard work, unfamiliar terrain. Families push outside their comfort zones. What set this season apart was one piece of casting. Among the three families was Jason Hanna and Joe Riggs, a married couple from Dallas raising 10-year-old twin sons born via surrogate. For a Magnolia network show, built around a brand that has spent over a decade positioning itself as warm, faith-forward, and family-friendly, the inclusion of a same-sex couple was never going to pass without comment. It didn't. The backlash arrived fast. Clips from the show spread across social media, and criticism poured in from conservative Christian pastors, commentators, and viewers who felt the Gaineses had drifted from the values they'd built their brand on. The most prominent voice belonged to Franklin Graham, son of the late evangelical pastor Billy Graham, who posted publicly that he found the casting decision very disappointing, framing it as a departure from what he considers biblical teaching on marriage. His statement argued that a show promoting that view of family shouldn't be something any Christian embraces. Other commentators piled on in the same direction, with thousands of comments accumulating under Chip's own promotional posts. On July 13, 2025, 3 days after premiere, Chip Gaines addressed the criticism directly on social media. He didn't do it with a carefully worded network statement. He did it in a handful of blunt posts on X, arguing that modern American Christian culture too often judges first and tries to understand later, if ever, and suggesting it was a sad state of affairs when non-believers encounter more hostility from Christians than warmth. It wasn't a hedge, and it wasn't an apology. It read like a man who decided the criticism wasn't going to change his answer. He didn't stop there. When one user pushed back, referencing a Bible verse listed in Chip's own social media bio as if it contradicted his position, Chip engaged directly, telling the user that he wasn't misusing the verse against them. He was applying exactly as intended, and suggesting the user seem more interested in the attention than the actual conversation. It was sharper than the easy-going, sledgehammer-swinging TV persona fans were used to, and it was clearly deliberate. The family at the center of the controversy didn't stay quiet either. Jason Hanna posted his own response, thanking Chip and Joanna for leading with love and for being willing to listen and learn through process. He and his husband later share a longer statement about what representation means for families like theirs. The idea that being visible on a mainstream show can make other people in similar situations feel less alone, even if visibility invites backlash along with it. It's worth saying plainly, this wasn't the first time Chip and Joanna have faced accusations about where they stand on LGBTQ+ issues. Years earlier, in a 2021 interview with The Hollywood Reporter, Joanna addressed similar claims head-on, saying accusations that she and Chip were racist or anti-LGBTQ felt completely disconnected from who they actually are, and admitting that kind of criticism was the kind that genuinely kept her up at night. So the Back to the Frontier backlash wasn't an isolated flashpoint. It was the latest round in a debate that's followed the Gaineses for years, resurfacing every time their public choices seem to cut against assumptions people have made about them based on their faith, their audience, or their brand. What made 2025's version different was the directness of the response. In the past, Chip and Joanna have often let their work speak for itself, sidestepping direct confrontation with critics. This time, Chip didn't sidestep anything. He answered questions in real time, in public, on a platform where every reply was screenshotted and reshared within minutes. Whatever else people took away from Back to the Frontier, the show forced a rare moment of clarity from a couple who typically keep their personal views close to the chest. Here's the part that separates the real story from a version built for dramatic effect. None of this slowed Chip and Joanna down. While the backlash over Back to the Frontier played out online to the back half of 2025, the Gaines business empire kept expanding on every front. Magnolia Network continued producing new seasons of its existing shows, including Magnolia Table, which moved into its 8th season, Magnolia Realty, Magnolia Homes, the retail stores of the silos, the restaurant, the bakery, and their partnership with Target on Hearth and Hand all continued operating at full speed. Collectively, Chip and Joanna's business holdings have been estimated at roughly $50 million, built across more revenue streams than most entertainment couples ever attempt to run simultaneously. There's no sign, in anything either of them has said publicly, of scaled-back ambitions or canceled projects. If anything, the willingness to make a show like Back to the Frontier, one that invited exactly the kind of controversy Magnolia had spent over a decade avoiding, suggests a couple more confident in their own instincts than at any earlier point in their career, not less. Strip away the headlines and the comment section arguments, And the day-to-day picture of the Gaines family in 2026 looks remarkably steady. Chip and Joanna now have 5 kids spanning a huge range of ages. Drake, 21, Ella, 19, Duke, 18, Emmy, 16, and Crew, 8. 2 of their older kids are already away at college, a transition Joanna and Chip have spoken about candidly, including the complicated mix of pride and sadness that came with sending Ella off to school. Watching a family move through that ordinary, universal milestone, a teenager leaving for college while a little brother is still young enough to need bedtime routines, says more about where this family actually is than any invented crisis could. In early August 2026, Joanna shared a batch of rare photos from a family trip to the Colorado mountains, all 5 kids together in one place at the same time, something that's gotten harder to pull off as the older ones scatter for school and work. The photos showed fishing trips, felled trees, homemade forts, French toast breakfast, a rodeo outing, bike rides, and hikes, the unglamorous, screen-free version of togetherness that doesn't always make it into a Magnolia Network promo reel. Joanna's caption captured a mother's plain, uncomplicated happiness at having everyone under one roof again, even briefly. That's not a family in crisis. It's a family in transition, the ordinary, bittersweet kind every household with older teenagers goes through, just lived out with cameras occasionally pointed at them. If there's a real thread connecting Joanna's ongoing back issues and the fallout from Back to the Frontier, it's this. Both stories show a couple choosing honesty over control. Joanna could have kept her surgeries and recoveries private, the way plenty of public figures manage chronic health issues quietly, off camera, unremarked upon. Instead, she's posted hospital photos, admitted to struggling with basic exercises after setbacks, and been open about a body that keeps demanding attention no matter how successful the business around her becomes. Chip could have let Back to the Frontier's backlash blow the way most celebrity controversies eventually do. Silence, a slow news cycle, on to the next headline. Instead, he engaged directly, argued his position in public, and let a genuinely divided audience see exactly where he stood, even knowing someone would walk away angry either way. Neither choice was risk-free. Being open about a chronic injury means fans and tabloids will keep tracking every flare-up as a story. Defending a casting decision publicly means picking a side in a culture war neither Chip nor Joanna has ever seemed eager to wade into. But both moments reveal something more honest about who they are than any polished brand messaging ever could. One thing that gets lost in a fast-moving news cycle is how differently the criticism actually broke down. It wasn't a simple story of one side attacking and the other side staying quiet. On one flank, conservative Christian commentators and pastors argued that Back to the Frontier's casting represented a departure from the values Magnolia had marketed for years, some going so far as to say the show promoted a view of marriage and family they believed no Christian should support. On the other flank, and this is a detail that often gets flattened out of the retellings, Chip and Joanna have faced years of criticism from the opposite direction too. Viewers and commentators who accuse them of being quietly unwelcoming to LGBTQ+ people because of their church's public stance on same-sex marriage. Even though neither Chip nor Joanna has ever issued a personal statement on the subject beyond what played out around this show, that's part of what made the 2025 backlash notable. It wasn't just conservative viewers reacting to a casting choice. It was a collision of 2 audiences who'd each, for different reasons, spent years suspicious of where the Gaineses actually stood. Casting Jason Hanna and Joe Riggs on Back to the Frontier did resolve that tension so much as force it into the open, in real time, with Chip fielding replies from both directions on the same afternoon. Franklin Graham's initial post came before the show had even premiered nationwide in full. He'd seen early clips and reporting and posted that he hoped what he was hearing wasn't true, adding that if it was, he found it very disappointing. Once it was confirmed, his follow-up statement went further, describing the show as promoting what he called an unbiblical view of family, and questioning why a couple who had, in his words, previously stood firm on the sanctity of marriage seemed to be reversing course. It's a serious accusation to level at 2 people who spent over a decade building a brand around faith-forward, family-friendly programming, and it's precisely the kind of statement that leaves no room for a vague, non-committal response. Chip's choice to respond directly, rather than let a publicist smooth it over, is arguably the most revealing part of the entire episode. He didn't release a statement through Magnolia's press team. He answered individual users, in his own voice, typos and all, in threads that anyone could read and screenshot. That's a very different posture than the brand had taken during earlier controversies, including the criticism the couple faced years earlier over the perceived distance from small-town, everyday viewers as their empire grew larger and more polished, or the backlash from segments of their original HGTV audience who felt Magnolia Network had moved too far from the show that made them famous in the first place. Zoom out far enough, and both of this year's biggest storylines, Joanna's back and Chip's response to the Frontier backlash, start to look like two versions of the same choice. Public figures of the Gaines' level of fame have every tool available to manage a narrative quietly. Representatives, carefully timed statements, silence until a story dies down on its own. Chip and Joanna have mostly declined to use those tools this year. Joanna didn't need to explain that her most recent procedure was tied to a 20-year-old cheerleading injury. She could have simply stepped back from public appearances for a few weeks and let fans assume she was busy. Instead, she's been specific, at times almost clinical, about what a microdiscectomy actually involves and why the timing of each flare-up has been frustrating. That kind of specificity isn't necessary for someone protecting an image. It's the kind of detail people share when they're not particularly worried about managing perception and more interested in just telling the truth. Chip's choice to keep replying to critics for days after the Frontier premiere reads the same way. A single statement would have technically satisfied the moment. Instead, he stayed in the replies, arguing his point person by person, long after the news cycle had moved on to other stories. Whether people agreed with his position or not, it wasn't a calculated PR move. It was a couple, again and again this year, choosing the harder, more exposed version of honesty over the easier, quieter version of image management. As of this summer, Joanna appears to be doing well, sharing an active, present version of herself in family photos rather than recovery updates. Back to the Frontier remains part of the Magnolia Network and HBO Max lineup. Its backlash mostly settled into the background noise that follows any culturally charged reality show months after release. The business keeps running. The kids keep growing up, going off to college, coming home from mountain trips, filling the same frames their parents have been photographed in for over a decade. There's no dramatic ending here. No goodbye. No empire quietly being dismantled behind the scenes. What there is instead is a couple navigating the two hardest things fame tends to expose: a body that doesn't always cooperate, and an audience that doesn't always agree. The same way they've navigated everything else since a chance meeting in an auto shop waiting room over